Welcome back to the Meth Lab, everybody. Last episode, we discussed some of the use cases for methodology and discipline in the legal industry to date, and most frequently used methods and cultural challenges around multidiscipline in the industry. This episode will discuss a little bit about value and measurement and how we use value and measurement to justify business change that we prioritise, but also how these principles impact culture when applied to ourselves and the personas across the ecosystem. I'd like to start by getting each of you to tell us a little bit about how you would define value from your perspectives. Horio, do you want to go first?
Sure, thank you. It's very interesting. In physics, we have various formulas. We think of the laws of nature, and one would expect that living in a world of science, there would be such a thing as the formula for value. There would be an equation where we plug in the elements and boom, we get the value element. Turns out that value is very context sensitive. Value is not something generic that applies equally to all areas of life, to all audiences, to all social contexts. Each community, each person has a specific set of values. What matters, what is meaningful to each of us is a little bit different. From a statistical perspective, there's a lot of commonality. Most of us value this rather than that. Most of us have agreed in modern day society to use money, for instance. So money is one aspect of value that's kind of inescapable in modern life. However, there are various areas of life in which money is not the only value or even the primary value. While in the commercial arena, money is essential. You want to make a profit. You want to make sure that you retain your ability to be in business. Therefore, the revenue that you make needs to be higher than the expenditure that you invest. In the social area, money is only a secondary aspect. Yes, you want to be mindful of your budget, but the actual outcome, the actual impact needs to take precedence. So how do we measure value? This is a tricky proposition because, unfortunately, very few organizations deliberately establish, shall we say, a scientific perspective of articulating an actual value model that they would then assess against. More often than not, it's just more of a, let's do this, hopefully it'll be okay, as opposed to very much the application of the scientific method to say, okay, our purpose is this is what we're trying to achieve, this is how we measure value, let's see what happens, right?
So I think it's incredibly perceptive to say that value is subjective. I think value is always going to be subjective from different industries, different disciplines, different cultures, different groups. But I think one of the problems with law is that even within our discipline, as Horia says, we've never agreed on what values you want to emphasize. We've never sat down and thought carefully about the role of law in a modern context for what is it meant to do. We have these rather jaded images of justitia weighing up the scales of justice and fairness, and that's what we cling to as an illusion of what we do. But it is very much, blindly clinging to that justice. But money has become a very important driver in what we offer, but also risk avoidance. Avoiding taking chances as a discipline has driven law for a very long time, and I think that's incredibly regrettable because it has stopped us from nurturing the more important roles and functions that we could be performing in a social science context. So in a social and cultural capacity, our legal culture should perhaps be more about that blind justice that we try to find, instead of trying to avoid the risks that our discipline ought to be taking but hasn't been taking because of the direction that it has veered off in over the last couple of decades. So I think if we are to define value from the perspective of the visual contracts and legal design projects, there are two very different answers. In a moment, hopefully, Peter will talk about the commercial side. But before he does that, and before we get all cynical and talk only about money, because it is regrettably one of the huge drivers for this, is that industry is seeing that with better contracts, better relationships, and more transparency, disputes and expensive misunderstandings can be avoided. And that's now what's driving, I think, a lot of the interest in what we are doing. But before we got to that point, we were actually able to measure 3 distinct categories of value within the impact of what we do. So we've done 2.5 years of impact testing of the comic book contract project, and we have looked specifically at comprehension. So how well are these contracts understood by the people who undertake visual contracts as compared to written contracts? So understanding the contractual contents and what are you getting into, that's a huge value, I think, for contract law. The next one that we've been looking at in impact is engagement. How well are people engaging in the process of contracting? Are they really spending the time and effort to think carefully about perhaps better outcomes or better negotiations or better understanding of how to drive their behavior and understanding the consequences of that comprehension, which has to come first? So that engagement is also a huge value, because only through engagement in that contractual relationship can you really explore the best potential that there is to offer. And the third category is one that we launched more or less as a safeguard on ensuring that people weren't resenting the notion of illustrated contracts, and that is perception. And perception is very linked to engagement. And to be completely honest, we only instigated it as a way of making sure that nobody felt patronized by these sometimes very naive and very simple childlike contracts. And it was very much paranoia on my part. And the thing
Childlike.
Okay, well, he doesn't think they're childlike, but I don't think they are either. But I wanted to make sure that nobody felt patronized by them. And so we put in this extra dimension of making sure that the perception of the people who held up these cartoon contracts wasn't negative. And instead of getting back just an affirmation that it wasn't negative, the data has suggested that it is the perception which is actually the most important aspect of this entire project, which has been hugely surprising. So the fact that anybody who engages in a contractual relationship where the comprehension and engagement is taken care of to such an extent that someone is actually willing to invest that kind of time, money, and effort into making it transparent and understandable, that drives the perception of a company which is ethical, moral, transparent, and puts the relationship first. And that has been a really eye-opening value that perhaps we hadn't thought through at the beginning of the project, but is certainly becoming crystal clear, that there are long-term, and then I'll hand over to the commercial side of things, but long-term commercially, I think the perception is just as important as the dispute avoidance and the engagement and comprehension data that we're also getting. So happy to talk more about that. We've got some boring stats we can share with you online, but I think Peter has a lot to say now.
Well, you started out by mentioning blind Justitia, and I don't think she's the key here. I think it's Hammurabi putting the law on stone tablets in front of his courthouse, or the English judge whose name now escaped me, who said the law must not just be done, it must be seen to be done. So for justice to be justice, it has to be predictable and it has to be approachable. And current contracts are neither. There are nightmares to work out what they do. So over on my side, I think that the key values I'm working with is transparency, that what's in the contract is actually, nothing is hidden, everything is up front, there is no hidden pitfalls, because people presume there are hidden pitfalls, people presume that there are small scribbles selling their firstborn. It's clarity, make it clear, make it obvious what the contract is about. Brevity is often a goal because it helps clarity and transparency. So those are the main goals. Approachability, that it's a contract that's easy to get to, that it invites you to read it rather than frightens you off.
So, I mean, I can see how all these factors feed into some of the categories that we've been measuring academically. And of course, that's no coincidence, since those are the same factors that we're working with, both on research projects and commercially. And I think if we were to sum it up with one word, I think that the real value, especially for contract law, is in relationships.
But Camilla mentioned that it's not just about preemptive conflict resolution. But the thing is, this also brings a preemptive conflict resolution. If I engage with a contract, not only am I less likely to end up in a conflict because I understand it, but I'm also more likely to have a positive view of the company and thereby contact them if I have a grievance, so they can avoid the ugly version of conflict and actually have the whole thing done as customer service instead.
Yeah.
There's another interesting aspect of contracts that I've come across, and I don't know how to articulate this better. I'm missing a word. It's something along the lines of non-surprising.
So what we work with there is transparency. So we talk a lot about transparency, both in the relationship and in the contract itself. So there's no fine print, no surprises.
But I think there's a difference between transparency and the lack of surprise. Because transparency says, here is what I'm proposing. The non-surprising part is if I do my work, we've had the contract, and all of a sudden, oh, but the contract said this, and that now I'm surprised. Why am I surprised? Right? So it's slightly a different aspect to, we've had the contract, but that was kind of obvious, that was transparent, but still, how do I get this kind of make sure you're not getting surprised? Yeah.
But also maybe benefits realization.
Comes down to articulation for me, I think, is a key point for me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting characteristic. Yeah.
But the interesting thing is, if we focus on the value of the contractual innovation as being on the relationship, then I think in any human interaction, when you make something more reasonable or understandable or relatable, then it's not as alienating. So instead of, to saying, we're going to change this at any time whenever we want to, which is really very confronting, if you explain why in the contract and make it relatable that it has to happen, then it's not so alienating. And we've seen that with a number of other contracts where some of the most unpleasant clauses can be made understood, like limitation of liability is another great challenge we've been facing in some of the commercial contracts for construction, where we simply have fleshed it out and said, look, we know that limitation of liability sounds ugly, as if we're not taking responsibility for what we're building. But if we had to be in the insurance business, we'd have to charge you a lot more. So therefore, we will guarantee to a certain limit, we have to limit ourselves to limit our risk so that we can charge fair prices. And by simply explaining that with a couple of, rather humorous illustrations on what we're not willing to carry in terms of liability, very literally, we can get that message across, and it just seems much more reasonable. And instead of people going, what are you not getting behind what you're doing? They're going, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense.
So we've mentioned a few things or elements that contribute to value. We've mentioned things like money, experience, relationships, perception. Horia, I'm curious to know from your perspective, how are you seeing these elements be used to assess the feasibility of change that occurs across industry? And what are the most common methods that you're seeing that are used for valuing and measuring business change that are applied in practice?
Right. Now, this is an area that is fraught with struggle and difficulty. And that, unfortunately, is dramatically influenced by the way in which we're accustomed to manage our organizations. Most organizations still have very much of a functional perspective. Therefore, I have this department, this other department, the other department. But value flow to the customer cuts across departments. It is highly unusual to have the value flow reaching a customer touch only one organizational unit. More often than not, you need a collaboration of numerous units. It's very much like a relay race. I do a little bit and then I pass it on to you, and then hopefully it kind of keeps going forward. But sometimes it even kind of gets a little bit 2 steps forward, 1 step back, kind of some handbacks and rework and so on. So in terms of understanding value, unfortunately, far too often people take a very blinkered approach. And then they just think in terms of, here's my little patch, here's my little unit, here's my department, here are my key performance indicators. And as long as I'm doing well by my indicators, I'm good. Because my incentives are this, I'm getting my bonus because of that, so I'm good. Yeah, it's not my fault that the poor customer is getting rubbish or is still waiting 3 years later. Hey, my metrics are good, I'm fine. And that is a fundamental problem, because if I really want a sustainable business, I need to care most about the value flow to my customer. I need to understand, how can I flow this value really well to my customer? And therefore, I really need to embrace a value stream and value network perspective. I need to visualize what is actually happening to value across the organization, and how is it influenced by all of these handovers. How can I actually optimize the flow of the stream of value? Where are the constraints? What can I do about them? And what does value actually mean? It's not just about me. It has to be about us. And a critical different aspect here as a suggestion is when you're engaged in examining a value flow, listen for the we-they boundary. The we-they boundary is when are people talking about we this, we that versus they this, they that. Because too often the we-they boundary will tell you a lot about where we care about value and they, oh, damn it, they don't. They are against us. They do this to us. They, oh, if only they did this and that, then, damn it, we could have good value flow, right? So listen for the we-they boundary and see what that tells you, what insights it gives you about value flow.
How do you think that we reduce this overemphasis that we're seeing on certain components of value like money and the overemphasis on our first runner in the relay race?
That's a really interesting question, because here's the thing. I'm not suggesting for a second that money is unimportant or we should ignore money. On the contrary, money is very useful as a measure of efficiency and effectiveness. When I want to deliver great impact, I want to do so in a cost-effective fashion. I want it to be sustainable rather than prohibitively expensive. So money is important no matter what you're doing. The challenge, however, is one of leadership mindset. So if anything, I want to inspire boards of directors and senior executives to take a much more holistic, a more systemic perspective of the impact of their organizations. In other words, don't just, okay, I may polarize a lot of people by phrasing things in this way, but many organizations behave very much like con artists, in that I'm going to chase the quarterly result, and if I get my quarterly result, I'm kind of going to grab it and run, so to speak. All of these share buybacks and sort of the various stock option remuneration packages and so on have this very short-term perspective, short-term view, money above all else perspective. I mean, it's almost like we've forgotten the ridiculousness of Tyco and Enron and so on, right? And there's a growing awareness, a growing realization in the broader world that it's insufficient to just think in terms of shareholder value. That is almost criminal, because we only have this world, and we can't think in terms of the economy just growing and growing and growing. That's called cancer in biology. Right? It's not healthy. Healthy is thriving, not unrestricted growth, right? So understanding value from that perspective, how do we thrive rather than just grow, 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 right? How do we actually become sustainable? How are we mindful of the societal impact of our organization? That, I think, is something that leadership communities really need to tackle.
It's interesting, and this comes back to the comments we were making last episode about societal constructs in relation to the legal profession. Camilla, I'm interested to know a little bit about, you and Peter have identified these elements of value that you want to measure with the comic contract work that you're doing.
Could I just make a comment about the money?
Yeah, can we just go? Do you mind, Natalie?
Because I slightly disagree here. That sounded like a little bit of an anti-capitalist rant. And I think the problem here is that companies are run short-sighted. Some of the great economic miracles after World War II was Italian family-owned companies. They had like 10,000 clothing companies, each run by a little family, and they prospered and grew because their view was, my great-grandchildren are going to run this company. They had this long-term view of where the company was going. And if we're looking at modern success stories, terrifying ones as they are, like Facebook, they tend to be driven by one person who's not just cashing in, he's building an empire. this idea that we're only going to measure our success of our company on profit this year is flawed, not just socially, but also economically. That's not what makes a hugely successful company. That is value. That is public perceptions of your company. And that will give you money in the end. It's just a long-term perspective instead of a short-term.
But I don't actually think the two of you disagree as much as it sounds like right now. I think you're both advocating a less blinkered approach to valuing monetary success.
Absolutely.
And I think I have the perfect story that I can share if you want to hear it, which is like a microcosmos of the problem that you're describing. One of my biggest sponsors on the team, which have been sponsoring us for the last 1.5 years in a 6-figure amount, they primarily wanted us to work on their contracts because they really needed to reduce their disputes and they really needed to have a friendlier image. So then the problem comes, we all agree that yes, they want to sponsor a big research project. So which department is going to pay for that? So dispute resolutions are saying, well, why should we pay for it? Because she's changing contracts and that's not our table. I'm not waiting that table. Contracts are saying, well, why should we pay for it? The primary savings are going to be in disputes. So they're the ones that are saving the money. And in the end, the people who are sponsoring us is the marketing department, who is the only department that cares about how everything is flowing, who goes, can we just stop this? We really want this done and we agree on this. We will pay for the research project. So I'm not currently financed by the marketing department of a large financial institution, which is so strange because we do not work in marketing and we are actually changing the contracts themselves. So it's such a strange construction, but it just speaks volumes to what Horia was saying about that microcosmos, that nobody is out for the bigger picture, they're out for their own department because that's how the whole company is set up. And it's not their fault because they're driven by KPIs. Everything that they do is driven by that microcosmos culture, which is so unhealthy.
Well, people used to go and work for a company after university and then they'd stay there for 40 years and retire with a gold watch. And now we expect to change jobs 10, 20 times, skipping around to climb up the ladder. It creates a different mindset.
It does. But even if you're not there for very long, you could still be proud of the bigger picture of the organization that you're working in. And I think a number of organizations have really got that. Our very first sponsor was Oricon, that's no secret. And they often, when we're on the lecture circuit together, share this wonderful story about what happened. So we changed their culture by changing their employment contract and turning that into a comic book. And the moment we did that, it changed the entire organization. So that flow of value that you were talking about, Horia, happened quite vividly within that organization because suddenly everyone started expecting simplified, illustrated communications on a daily basis, to the point where 1.5 years after we had implemented the contract project, they have employed 3 times as many graphic artists to illustrate everything. And when they had their annual stakeholders meetings and they got that lengthy report to look through, they leafed through it and nobody wanted to engage with it because it had no illustrations. So it was sent back for illustration and simplification. And then when the board received the comic book version of it, then they sat down and took it seriously. So the whole organization changed the way that it communicated based on that little tiny change at the gates where the employees come in. And it was beautiful to see how that whole value shift changed. And suddenly the simplification and the ease that illustrations bring was at the heart of the organization.
Fabulous. Thank you. And thanks, guys. Next time, we're going to be talking more about teams and collaboration and influence. We'll talk in a lot more detail around particular areas of methodology and discipline, things like how we value the work that we do and measure the work that we do, how we ensure quality is maintained in the work that we do, and how we validate and accept the changes that we make within business. Really looking forward to speaking with you next week. And if any of our listeners are interested in hearing the full conversation, you can contact us and we're happy to share a feature-length version of the recording.